All right, properties of real numbers. So we're going to look at different properties, um, the additive identity, multiplicative identity. So we're going to be looking at identities and inverses today, and then look at some of the classifying some things. So the four basic math operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Because subtraction is addition of the opposite and division is multiplication by the reciprocal, the properties of real numbers focus on addition and multiplication. So we have these four properties of real numbers that involve identities and inverses. The additive identity property just says that if we add 0, we get that same number. So the additive identity means when we add 0 to a number, we get that number again. The multiplicative identity says when we multiply by 1, we get the same number. Okay? So adding by 0, multiplying by 1, we get the same thing. Additive inverse says when we add the opposite, we get 0. So what does it take to get 0? Would be adding the opposite, okay, which is the additive inverse. Multiplicative inverse, what do I multiply by to get 1? And that's the reciprocal. So those four properties, things that make sense to you, but just a little reminder that, so additive identity, we add 0, get the same number. Multiply by 1, we get the same number. Additive inverse, they're the opposite because when I add them, I get 0. Multiplicative inverse, when I multiply two numbers, I get 1. So it has to be the reciprocal. And whether it's positive or negative, it's still the reciprocal. So we're here, we have the number 12. They want us to find the additive and multiplicative inverses. So additive inverse property, the sum of a number and its opposite or additive inverse is 0. So what do I add to 12 to get 0? Okay, negative 12. So the additive inverse is negative 12. The opposite of 12, because when I add them together, I get 0. The multiplicative inverse. When we multiply them together, I get 1. So that means I need to multiply that number times its reciprocal. And the reciprocal of 12 is 1 over 12. All right, so you find the additive inverse and multiplicative inverse of. Okay, properties of real numbers. Some of these properties you'll remember. You actually use them quite often. You just don't necessarily think about them. The closure property is not one that's really talked about a whole lot, but it does come into play once in a while. All it means is that it says the sum or product of any two real numbers is a real number. If I add two real numbers, I get a real number. If I multiply two real numbers, I get a real number. That's all the closure property says. Not anything that you'll be spending a lot of time playing around with. But we will look at, we do use this one here, the commutative property of addition or multiplication. And all the commutative property means is we're going to change the order. So if we're adding 7 and 11, that's the same as adding 11 plus 7. If I'm multiplying 7 times 11, it's the same as multiplying 11 times 7. Okay, the commutative property means we're just going to change the order. The associative property. Okay, the associative property tells us we're going to change the grouping. In other words, we're changing what numbers are grouped together. So if you look at the addition part here, 5 plus 3, those two are combined with parentheses, plus 7, is the same as 5 plus, in parentheses, 3 plus 7. So they changed the grouping. They changed which ones were in the parentheses. In the multiplication, 5 times 3 is in the parentheses, then times 7. Change it to 3 times 7 in the parentheses, times 5. Okay? Or you have the ones with the letters, using variables. But all the associative property is I'm changing which ones are grouped together. Now, is the answer going to be the same? Yes, it is. Okay? For it to be true, then the answer for them would have to be the same also. So if I switch the order with commutative property, or I switch the grouping with associative property, I'm still going to get the same answer. And then the last one is the distributive property, which we use all the time. If I have a number on the outside of the parentheses, I multiply it by each individual thing on the inside of the parentheses. So 5 times the quantity 2 plus 8 is the same as 5 times 2 plus 5 times 8. And it doesn't matter whether it's on the left side of the parenthesis or the right side of the parenthesis, still means the same thing. How many of you remember all three of those properties? Okay, hearing about them and using them. Okay, so we're gonna identify them then. Okay. So these are all on page 15. So here's what we're looking for. One of the things you can think about this way. Distributive property, you're getting rid of the parenthesis, right? Okay. If it's commutative property, we change the order. If it's associative property, we change the grouping. And so when we write it down, we would say commutative property of addition if you're adding. Or we'd say associative property of multiplication if it's multiplication going on. So letter A here. Did we change the grouping or change the order? 2 times 3.9 equals 3.9 times 2. Okay, that's a change of order, right? We switched them around. Which one's first? So that is the commutative property. And since there's multiplication going on there, it's the commutative property of multiplication. So you need to say this, commutative property of multiplication. Letter B. Three times the quantity 2 square roots of 8 equals the quantity 3 times 2 times the square root of 8. Does that change the order, or does it change which ones are grouped together? Okay, change the ones that are grouped together. So if it changes the ones that's grouped together, that would be the associative property then of, is this addition or multiplication? Multiplication. So we would say it's the associative property of multiplication. All right, a little mental math. Let's do some mental math then. All right. Now, how many of you can go to a store or go to a restaurant and in your head figure out the tip for your parents? Okay. How many of you should be able to figure out the tip for your parents in your head? Okay, probably all of us, right? Okay. Now, nowadays, now you can just ask Siri. Unfortunately, that's true, but nowadays, what is it normally you give what kind of a tip? Okay, 15%. Matt just gives them $6 regardless. Okay. So, man, you're generous, Matt. Okay. Now, so a 5% tax on $42.40. Unfortunately, Michigan uses 6%, so it's not quite as easy to figure out. But let's think about 5% tax then. Well, what's the easiest percent to find? Okay, 10% is, right? Because all we have to do is move a decimal. So first of all, we could do 10%. So 10% of $42.40 would be $4.24, right? So how does 5% compare to 10% then? Okay, that's half of it. So then 5% of 42.40 would be half of that, or $2.12. Okay. All right, so use your head and not your calculator then to figure out 20% of $15.60 shirt. All right, classifying statements as always, sometimes, or never true. So here we're going to look at some statements, and we want to know, all right, are these true or not? And they're only going to be true or not, sometimes, always, or never. First of all, if I'm going to look at, are one of the properties satisfied? Does it meet one of these properties, commutative, associative, and distributive? If it does, then what? Okay, it's always true then. If it meets one of these properties, it's always going to be true. If it doesn't meet them, then it might sometimes be true and other times not. What would be the most likely numbers to use to check if something is sometimes true or not? What would be the best numbers to use? 1, 2, or my favorite, which is 0. Okay? Because 0 always helps me to figure things out, because when I'm checking y-intercepts, when I'm doing other things, 0 is usually a much nicer number to use than others. Now, this says for letter A, now it says A times B equals A. First of all, does that meet any of our properties? Do any of our properties look like that? Does that look like a commutative or associative or distributive property? No, it doesn't look like any of them, right? There's no order change. There's no B over on the right-hand side, so it's none of those properties, okay? So if I multiply a number times B, will I ever get that same number? Who said yes? You did? What number? What? But we're talking about the number we're going to look at is A. Okay, so if A is equal to 0, then it's true. All right, let's see. So 0 times 3 equals 0. Okay, that's true. All right. Now, is it true for any other number? 3. So it's not. It doesn't work for 1. Would it work for anything else then? Okay. No. So this is sometimes. And my sometimes would be when a equals 0. Okay. So if it doesn't meet one of the properties, try a couple numbers to see if it's true sometimes, like 0 or 1. Those would be two numbers that would be easy to check and see if they are. Okay. Letter B, is this meet one of our properties? Matt's giving a thumbs up. So which property is that, Matt? Okay, so this is the distributive property. Since it's the distributive property, that would mean that this is always true. Because that's what those properties are for. They imply it's always going to be correct. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a property anymore. Okay? Always going to be correct.